Welcome back with us here on the Newsfeed Late Night. Well, today marks 104 years since the 616 South African officers died on the SS Mendi en route to support the British War, World War I, that is. Joining me now to commemorate the events is the manager of Maritime and Underwater Cultural Heritage Unit at the South African Heritage Resource Agency, John Gribble. John, good evening and thank you very much for your time tonight. Why is this?
Good evening, good to be here.
Why is the story of the SS Mendi so pivotal and intertwined and linked to the South African story?
I think it's one of those stories that's been largely forgotten by history until relatively recently, and it's really got to do with the politics of South Africa during the 20th century. But it really a very important story, particularly for I suppose for nation building, for national integration, for making the case for South Africans being a nation, a nation that's together, a nation of people that pull together.
So, just for someone who might not know the story, just take us back 1917 on the 21st of February. What actually happened?
There was the steamship, the Mendi, was a troop ship that had been commissioned by the UK government to carry troops, first of all, from West Africa to East Africa, Nigerian troops. And then on the way back, the Mendi stopped off in Cape Town to pick up a contingent of South African laborers who'd enlisted within the South African, the Union Defence Force at that stage, and were on their way to the Western Front. The ship then sailed from Cape Town to the UK, and they were literally on the last leg of their voyage. They had one more trip to go across the Channel to France before the men disembarked in France. And the morning, very early in the morning of the 21st, 5 a.m. in the morning, it was still dark. It was midwinter in Europe, very foggy out in the Channel. The Mendi was traveling very, very slowly to deal with the fog, keeping a lookout as they should. And at about 5 o'clock in the morning, lookouts on board the Mendi heard another ship approaching. They rang the alarms, they flashed their lights, but a ship came out of the mist and collided with the Mendi. The other ship was coming up from France, heading back to the UK, traveling at huge speed, and collided with the sort of just back from the bow of the Mendi, roughly where many of the troops were actually quartered that night. Most of the men on board were asleep. It was 5 in the morning. It was very cold. They were below decks. And it would have come as a huge shock, this collision. I suspect that many of the men on board died probably instantly as the hull began to flood. Men then flocked up the gangways, up onto the deck. And within 20 minutes, the ship had sunk and more than 600 people died in that time.
Now, it's described, or I suppose it establishes one of the biggest disasters ever to befall a nation. In fact, qualifies as a national tragedy. Now, we've been playing clips of the former president talking about Parliament and how it doesn't foster social cohesion. I suppose at the onset of this particular event, it trumped even the racial divide that was existing in the nation at the time.
Well, yes, in fact, it did. It was, although the men on board the Mendi had been enlisted in the army because they were black South Africans, they were not allowed to fight. They were enlisted as non-combatants. The government at the time was very worried that giving them training in weapons would upset the status quo in South Africa in the 19-teens. So they were there as laborers. And yet, when this tragedy happened, as soon as news arrived in South Africa, Parliament actually, it was announced in Parliament, and General Louis Botha, who was the Prime Minister at the time, announced it. And there was a minute's silence in Parliament. All the parliamentarians stood and held a minute's silence for the loss of their fellow South Africans, even though there was this kind of racism that was inherent in the role that these men had been given to play in South Africa's effort in World War I.
Were there any survivors, John?
There were, there were about 120 odd survivors. A couple of ships came to the rescue. The ship that hit them, in fact, did nothing. Some of the men made it to the ship in some of the life rafts that had been launched from the Mendi, but the ship the Darrow that hit the Mendi really didn't do anything to help in any big way. But ships came from far and wide. There was a destroyer, a Royal Navy destroyer that was accompanying the Mendi, and she picked up a number of survivors. And another ship that picked up an SOS or a Mayday call came from quite a long way away and picked up some survivors. So as I say, about 127 men, I think, if I remember correctly, survived.
Now, I believe there have been a couple of monuments erected all across South Africa, as well as maybe in other parts of the world. I mean, how is this event commemorated?
It's commemorated in quite a big way now these days. As I said earlier, it was something that was really forgotten for many, many years, and it was a kind of deliberate amnesia. I think the South African government at the time wasn't willing to recognize the contribution that Black South Africans had made to South Africa's role in World War I. And it was a political issue. They didn't want to recognize it because then Black South Africans would have a reason to perhaps go to the British King and say, look, we helped out, you need to help us out here. But in the last, I suppose since 1994 in particular, a large number of memorials have been erected around the country, as you say. Perhaps the best known is at the University of Cape Town, which has been erected just below what are now the UCT sports fields. And that was at the time the Rosebank Showgrounds, and that is the site of the South African Native Labour Corps camp. The men from all over South Africa who joined the Labour Corps and who were then sent off to Europe came to Cape Town and all camped on these what are now sports fields before being shipped out. There are other memorials. There's one in Port Elizabeth. There's one in Soweto. There's one in the Eastern Cape. Trying to think where the others are. There are also a couple of memorials overseas. There's a memorial in Southampton, the Hollybrook Memorial, to people who were lost at sea during the two world wars. And there's a large section of that memorial devoted to the Mendi.
Now, the South African High Commissioner then in 2007, Lindiwe Mabuza, said at the heart of the Mendi's tragedy was that the men's bodies could not be retrieved and laid to rest. And she said that their souls are not sitting well in the English Channel, and ours are not very healthy as long as we do not do what is right and what is necessary. If we don't tell and retell their story, they would definitely have died in vain. That kind of captures it, John, doesn't it? The whole story of why this is such an important story and continues to be told today.
It very much does. Absolutely. I think it really is important. These were men who had given themselves up. They had volunteered to serve their country, to serve at the time their king. And the fact that they've been forgotten for such a long time really is very important that we do commemorate them now and make sure that the wreck of the Mendi, where it sits on the seabed in the UK, is a fitting grave and a fitting memorial to them. Even though we cannot retrieve their bodies, we can't bring them back to South Africa, that little piece of the English Channel, I think, will always remain a bit of South Africa and a piece of South African history.
That was John Gribble there from the South African Heritage Resource Agency. Appreciate your time and thank you very much for